We are gratefully coming to you from Treaty 1 territory, home of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and homeland of the Métis Nation. We are grateful for those who have been caretakers and stewards of this land, past, present, and future. My name is Carrie Miller, and I will be the host of this discussion. I am here on behalf of Arosha Manitoba, a creation care organization that works to transform the lives of people and places by showing God's love for all creation. As well, I am a graduating student of Canadian Mennonite University with an interdisciplinary degree in thanatology, which is the study of death. Before we dive into our four incredible panelists, I would like to begin by giving a brief account of the inspiration for this event. As I had mentioned before, my degree is in thanatology, which is the study of death. In particular, I have been fascinated by the question of grief and pain and how exactly this relates to our humanity. To be human means to be fallible, to be mortal, and we are beings towards death, a phrase borrowed from Heidegger. Unfortunately, I'm inclined to say that in our North American society, we don't always know how to grieve our pain well, instead finding numbing agents and quick fixes. Now, I'm not saying we should get rid of medication or to celebrate painful situations. Rather, I am wondering if there are healthier ways to acknowledge and to name our grief, to share it with others, and in doing so, begin healing from it. These studies and explorations are rooted in a deeply personal experience I had with death a few years ago. After a long battle with mental illness, a close friend of mine and of the CMU community took her life. This was devastating, and the grief was overwhelming for many of us. This is when I began asking questions for my own pursuit of healing, around what it means to truly feel pain and to grieve well. Amidst this period of personal grief, our world entered into a global pandemic, and it felt like a loss everywhere. At this time, I had the opportunity to work with Arosha Manitoba, a creation care organization. Through a position running day camps, I was challenged to broaden my scope of grief to that of our natural world. It felt like Arosha was offering a new lens through which to understand our humanity and our inherent connection to the earth. Through working with Arosha, I was introduced to a different narrative around human mortality, one that saw human life as part of a greater circle, where death is kin to life. Take compost, for example. It is created from decaying plants and old food waste, yet it is teeming with nutrients and new life. Out of death comes new life. It seems that an essential aspect of our humanity, our understanding of death, is found within our connection to the natural world. Robert Pogue Harrison, a scholar whom I have spent much time reading, would remind humans that we first came from humus, which is Latin for soil, and to the soil of the earth our bodies will eventually return. He points out that the root of the word ecology stems from the Greek word oikos, meaning home, and the Greek word logos, which means relationship. Our home, to that which humans belong, is found in relationship within the natural world. Unfortunately, as our society has abstracted death and numbed pain, in many ways we have become estranged from the natural world. We live in houses, isolated from the sun and the soil, blind to the cycles of the seasons and the kinship of life and death. In doing so, we have lost sight of the ways in which our earth is being exploited, consumed, and mined for resources. We face climate change, an increase in natural disasters, and further destruction of the earth. Most of this affects those who are marginalized, making climate change a political issue as well as an ecological problem. If ecology refers to our relationship with the environment as our home, then our home is experiencing rapid destruction, often at our very own hands. So what do? Anxiety, despair, anger, and guilt are some of the many emotions that come flooding when I think about this. Pulling from my degree in thanatology, as well as from an independent study in ecological grief, I recognize that acknowledging these emotions through practice of mourning and lament are the first step in stopping ourselves from feeling stuck. Lament is a profoundly hopeful act, one that creates space for grief to be acknowledged while seeing the potential for a better future. Hannah Malcolm, an environmental theologian, says grief is an expression of love. Our grief takes the shape of places and creatures to whom we intimately belong. Our ecological grief allows us to process our overwhelming emotions, then to step forward in hope that our connection with the land, our home with which we belong, can be restored in new ways. Hannah Malcolm continues, quote, "Life emerges from death. If one world is ending, God will continue to bring life." Unquote. Today, we are gathered to discuss the ways in which each of our panelists have encountered ecological grief in their own experiences and how they find hope. All of our panelists are active in taking action against climate change, in raising awareness, and in finding hope in their everyday lives. Marta Bunnett Wiebe is a peace and advocacy coordinator with MCC Manitoba. She grew up as a farmer and is the editor of a new book titled Germinating Conversations, Stories from Sustained Rural-Urban Dialogue on Food, Faith, and the Land. Bob Haverluck is a local artist. He's a theologian and an ecological activist who uses storytelling and art to engage issues of violence against the earth and her creatures. Josiah Neufeld is a local journalist and a fiction writer who has spent great amounts of time thinking and acting upon the global climate crisis. Zoe Matties is the program manager for Russia, and she is the co-founder of Wild Church Winnipeg, an emerging community of worship. All of these extraordinary people have come together to discuss and to share where they experience ecological grief and the ways in which they are exploring hope. Join us now as we listen to Marta as she shares.
Thanks, Carrie, and thanks to Arasha and CMU for hosting this event. As Carrie mentioned, I have been significantly shaped by my experiences farming and growing food. And it is often from a lens of growing and eating food that I engage with other larger conversations around climate change, around biodiversity loss, and exploitation of the land. So with that in mind, I'd like to begin by sharing a quote. And this is a quote from a friend of mine, Terry Muro. He once said, "I would rather characterize farming as a constant play between hope and despair. And in the despair, you have to be able to step away from it for a minute and see that it has shown you something that can give you hope." I think this may hold true in a larger conversation around climate change. For the sake of brevity, I will be focusing my thoughts on food, and specifically the eating of food. Eating is one of the most intimate ways we are connected with the earth. We rely on the earth for daily sustenance. Often several times a day we eat. In this necessity of life, we are bound in relationship to the land, water, and creatures. Yet, too often we are unaware or inattentive to those relationships, to the detriment of our spirits and the life and well-being of the earth. Our inattentiveness to the way our food is grown leaves us ignorant of the toil our eating has on the earth. To draw an analogy from Wendell Berry, the way we eat today is like a one-night stand. We want to enjoy the meal, but we don't care to know it's past, and we won't remember it the next day. Becoming aware of the nature of the food system, as with an awareness of the changing climate, leads to the grief and despair we are here to talk about tonight. A constant play between hope and despair. This names the tension I think many of us feel. We see the beauty and goodness of creation, which inspires hope. And we also see the damage, the loss, the exploitation of the earth, and we move towards despair. I believe that it is within this tension between hope and despair that the practice of lament resides. Lament is unique from despair in that lament is the practice of trusting God with our grief, whereas despair is a loss of trust in God and in the possibility of a future for the earth in the case of ecological despair. Despair is the lack of imagination for other possibilities. Lament, on the other hand, does not give up, even in spite of it all. The practice of lament, as opposed to despair, draws us back to God. Lament is humbling. We come to recognize our place as creatures of God, as participants of creation dependent on the gifts of life and of food provided for us by God in creation. Lament is the acknowledgement of relationship and relationship severed. This is why lament sits within the tension of hope and despair. For in participating in the act of ecological lament, when we come to an awareness of our relationships, however severed they may be, we enter the possibility for renewing those relationships. When we come to an awareness of our own creatureliness, our own daily reliance on those relationships that provide us with food, there opens a possibility for repairing those relationships. As great as the magnitude of the climate crisis is, our response is only as great as our relationships. As Barry writes, the question that must be addressed, therefore, is not how to care for the planet, but how to care for the planet's millions of human and natural neighbors. As he goes on to say, we must begin to see everything as our neighbors, creatures with whom we have relationship, so that we may proceed with love, that is, affection in action. We cannot love what we do not know. And though our relationships in a globalized world are far-reaching, I cannot imagine relationships any closer than those that provide us with our daily sustenance. Now, much more could be said on this topic of eating and on hope and despair and lament, and we'll continue to have that tonight. Not least of the which is also the practice of repentance and how that fits in. But I'll end by returning to the quote shared at the beginning. I would rather characterize farming as a constant play between hope and despair. And in the despair, you have to be able to step away from it for a minute and see that it has shown you something that can give you hope. Perhaps it is in the despair that we have to step away, to see what it is showing us, to see the relationships we are grieving, and in so doing, see the possibility for reconciliation and hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. Now it is time for Josiah to share. Josiah?
Hi there. In the summer of 2018, a heat wave hit Great Britain that caused the railroad tracks to buckle and the roof of the Science Centre in Glasgow to melt. That summer, a British professor of sustainability published a paper on his website. Now, most academic papers are read by an average of 3 people, maybe 5, mostly academics. But this one was different. Within a year, it had been downloaded 500,000 times and had caused tens of thousands of readers around the world to reevaluate their lives. The paper's author, Jem Bendell, studied the data on climate change and came to the conclusion that the first domino had already been tipped in a cascade of events that would cause the collapse of human society within his own lifetime. His prescription was blunt. Instead of trying to preserve global civilization in its current state, he suggested, we should begin to prepare mentally, emotionally, and spiritually for its collapse. He called his approach deep adaptation. I came across the paper sometime in the spring of 2019. I remember feeling my skin tighten around my body as I read it. The bottom seemed to drop out of my stomach. I wanted to go lie down in a dark room and cry. As it turned out, Bendell's interpretation of the science was somewhat flawed. Scientists have since pointed out errors in his data and noted his reliance on some sketchy sources. The good news is the apocalypse likely isn't coming as fast as Bendell predicted. The bad news is, well, still pretty bad. 1 million species of animals and plants are currently on the brink of extinction. 40% of all wildlife has been wiped out in my lifetime. Humans are driving the greatest extinction event since an asteroid strike altered the Earth's climate 66 million years ago. We've pushed the planet outside of the stable range in which human civilization evolved. Hundreds of thousands of people read Deep Adaptation. Some quit their jobs in finance or academia to become full-time activists. Some moved to the country and started small farms to grow their own food. Some joined grief support circles. Despite its flaws, and there are flaws, I believe Deep Adaptation struck a chord with people because it opened up a space for them to talk about grief at a moment in human history when we are just beginning to grasp how much we have to lose. I do believe there is much for us to do. We will have to fight with everything we have to end the fossil fuel industry, to preserve what remains of our forests, to build resilient communities, to create new, less exploitative economies. But I also believe that in order to do that work well, we have to allow ourselves space to grieve. To do that work, we must clear a space for our sorrow. When I think about holding both of these things in tension, action and sorrow, I think about Etty Hillesum. Etty Hillesum was a young Jewish woman who lived in Amsterdam at the time when her country was occupied by Nazi Germany in the 1940s. Etty Hillesum died in Auschwitz when she was 29 years old. Some decades later, her diaries were discovered and were published. Reading Etty Hillesum's diary now is a powerful experience because, unlike most books, the author does not know how it will end. She's writing from the middle of her story. It can be tempting to proclaim with finality that human civilization will collapse, because certainty sometimes feels easier to bear than uncertainty. But we don't know. We don't know how the story will end. Etty Hillesum brings us a testimony from someone in the middle of a story, in the middle of resisting the forces of destruction, while also taking time to grieve what is being lost. The last part of my talk is going to be a short reading from her diary because I believe her words are powerful and meaningful for us at this time. In March 1942, Etty Hillesum wrote the following diary entry. The trees, sometimes at night their branches bow down under the weight of the fruit of the stars. Now they are menacing daggers, piercing the bright spring air. Yet even in their new shape and setting, they are unspeakably beautiful. I remember a walk along the Amsterdam Canal, one dreamlike summer night, long, long ago. I had visions then of ruined cities. I saw old cities vanish and new cities arise. And I thought to myself, even if the whole of this world is bombed to bits, we shall build a new world, and that new one too will pass. And still life will be beautiful, always beautiful. Ought we not, from time to time, open ourselves up to cosmic sadness? Yes, life is beautiful, and I value it anew at the end of every day, even though I know that the sons of mothers are being murdered in concentration camps. You must be able to bear your sorrow. Even if it seems to crush you, you will be able to stand up again. For human beings are so strong. Your sorrow must become an integral part of yourself, part of your body and your soul. You mustn't run away from it, but bear it like an adult. Do not relieve your feelings through hatred. Do not seek to be avenged on all German mothers, for they too sorrow at this very moment for their slain and murdered sons. Give your sorrow all the space and shelter in yourself that is its due. For if everyone bears their grief honestly and courageously, the sorrow that now fills the world will abate. But if you do not clear a decent shelter for your sorrow, and instead reserve most of the space inside of you for hatred and thoughts of revenge, from which new sorrows will be born for others, then sorrow will never cease in this world and will multiply. And if you have given sorrow the space its gentle origins demand, then you may truly say, life is beautiful and so rich, so beautiful and so rich that it makes you want to believe in God. Thank you.
Thank you, Josiah. Now it's time for Bob to speak. Bob, take us away.
One story it invites another. You know that from the dinner table. or the pub. Yeah, so stories generate stories. There's a story by Sinclair Ross, prairie writer Sinclair Ross. And he tells of a farm family on the prairies in the 1930s. One year after another, their crops failed. But in the third year, their last hope of managing to remain on the farm, the spring rains come and the crop develops and greens and grows and the kernels fill out. But just days before the harvest, there's a hailstorm and destroys the crop utterly. The husband walks out into the field to the far end and around and discovers there's nothing left, and comes back and tells his wife this as they stand on the porch. And then he turns and walks to the barn and goes over to the horse, buries his face in the side of the horse, and begins to cry. Margaret Lawrence writes about this story, and she says, it's not a tragedy that the people on the prairies suffered. The tragedy is they insisted on suffering alone. And the lament in the side of the horse was genuine and deep, but it was not with his closest human partner. And there may be a kind of wisdom in that, but it does reflect the need that grief be a community expression. There's been a lot written about personal grief and at the individual level, but the grief is most wisely expressed in forms of community with the larger world. And there's a wonderful passage in Miguel, you Spanish speakers, you come out of the woodwork, Unamuno, in the tragic sense of life. He's preoccupied with some of these questions. But he says, and this is written in about 1927, 28, just when the fascists were rising in Spain and the military love of death was being celebrated. And he was in the midst of it and resisted it. And here's a passage. It says, I am convinced that we should solve many things if we all went into the streets and uncovered our griefs, which perhaps would prove to be but one sole common grief, and joined together in beweeping them and crying aloud to the heavens and calling upon God. And this, even though God should hear us not, but he would hear us. The chiefest sanctity of a temple is that it is a place to which we go to weep in common. A misery sung in common by a multitude tormented by a destiny has as much value as a philosophy. It is not enough to cure the plague. We must learn to weep for it. Yet we must learn to weep. Perhaps that is a supreme wisdom. So to weep, not alone, but to seek out community. So it's not only the words and the saying, but there are the forms and the rituals and the role of community in the embodiment of grief and its bodying forth. There's another element, and the psychiatrist Joel Koval, who's is a radical who in psychiatry, as well as his social vision. And he speaks of a patient during the Cold War coming, and she came with a great depression, with a great sorrow that she could not get out of. And they talked, and in the process, it became clear that her at base was this great fear of nuclear annihilation and the destruction of the earth, livable earth for humans. And in this, she was locked. So they talked, and one of the first things that came out of it is he suggested that she begin trying to engage it. So she said, yes, that might help. And so when she went home, she began writing letters to those in positions of power and decision-making. And when she came back, she said, well, that helped a little, but it doesn't touch the depth of my grief. And then together, they arrived at the conclusion that she should go into the streets, which she did. So she became very active and engaged in actions in the street and in the halls of Congress. And only after that did her sorrow lighten, both because of her engagement, but because of her encounter with other people's sorrow in community that diminished the size of her own. Prior to that, she could not get past her own, but once in community, she had the gift of being among others whose sorrow told her that hers was only a piece and not all. And in that, there was a freedom. One other element, and I'm being indirect here about my own response, but there's one other story I think to keep in mind to map out the terrain, and it's a story you all know. Recall this. Recall Jesus before Jerusalem. Recall Jesus before the holy city, the center of the new creation, the new earth. And there he begins, not like his disciples, whose first impression was, wow, look at those buildings. Jesus' impression was sorrow, weeping, being called for. And so Jesus begins by crying outside the city. Jesus grieves. But the next thing he does is he goes into the city and confronts the source of the grief. He turns the grief into grievance. Not that he ceased to grieve, not that he ceased to express the sorrow, but also the next step was to engage what causes the grief and the sorrow. So he goes to the temple, the center of life in the city, in the center of the new creation. And in that, I think, embodies the necessity of grief and its relationship to the source of the grief needing to be engaged, as well as the saying of the sorrow. And the saying of the sorrow does open things up, but it needs to be said in community, I think, and it needs to be said in relationship to the powers that create it. And finally, I would say it needs to seek creative ways of doing that, of engaging. And simply, there are different paths for each of us. For me, as a would-be storyteller and artist, it's the path of the arts in partnership with different groups who are seeking to engage the source of our grievance and the source of our grief, as well as those who I gather with to be in joy and in sorrow, to be with the stuff of the earth, its wonders and delights, but also to brood and to engage its wounds. So with that, I conclude.
Thank you, Bob. Zoe, it is your turn to speak. We are excited to hear.
So I'm going to be talking a little bit about food as well. My journey with ecological grief began a number of years ago when I took part in a 2-week intensive course on food and faith on a farm on Galiano Island off the coast of BC. A significant aspect of this course was participating in the slaughtering of a lamb that we would then cook and eat together as a part of our final celebration. On the day of the slaughter, I can remember standing outside the barn stall, watching as the shot rang out and the sheep fell. I saw its body twitching and shaking as the muscles contracted and relaxed for the last time. And then it was over. The swiftness of it all was like a punch in the gut. And then we participated in the rest of the slaughtering process and hung the meat for the rest of the week. And a week later, as we were preparing the meal and sat down together, we were forced to reckon with the fact that although eating is one of the greatest delights of life, as Norman Wurzba puts it, death is eating's steadfast accomplice. Even vegetarian eating implicates us in death. Every time we bring a bite of food to our mouths, we are participating in this cycle, whereby all that is living emerges from the ground, is nourished by the ground, and when the time comes, returns to the ground in death. Indigenous botanist Robin Wall Kimmerer writes in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, "It is the way the world works, the exchange of a life for a life, the endless cycling between my body and the body of the world." For many thousands of years, humans acknowledged and honored this cycle, seeking to never take more than they needed out of respect and understanding that their very existence depended on the gift of these plants and animals. And my experience of participating in the slaughtering of an animal was an unmistakable reminder to me that I am finite, just like the lamb. I am dependent on the gift of creation to sustain me. And one day I will also return to the soil from which I was created. The experience also helped me to see that our failure to acknowledge these truths has led us to take more from the earth than is sustainable, which has led to widespread destruction and has entered us into a time of extreme biodiversity loss. The practice of ecological grief is important, especially for us in Western cultures, because it forces us to come to grips with the effect of our presence on this earth. Psychotherapist Francis Weller, in his book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, writes, "Sorrow helps us remember something long intuited by Indigenous people across the planet. Our lives are intricately commingled with one another, with animals, plants, watersheds, and soil." Weller writes that we all must undertake an apprenticeship with sorrow, and that it's a skill and a practice that we must develop. So while my experience with the lamb taught me theoretically about grief and death and cycles of life and death, my practice of ecological grief became a lot more personal 2 years ago when my friend Danielle was killed on her way to the UN environmental meetings in Nairobi, Kenya. The flight she was on crashed outside of Addis Ababa, killing all 157 people on board. My friend Danielle and I connected about many things, but most of all, we connected over our shared love of nature and our concern for the future of the planet. We would often talk through our fears and our sorrows about the future of the planet and wonder about where hope could be found. For Danielle, hope meant transforming her grief and fear into action. In the months before her death, she embarked on a project she called The Cautious Optimist, Life as a Learning Lab. You can look that up online. It's still up there. Her goal was to learn one new skill each month, such as sewing, woodworking, or gardening, which would help her survive at the end of the world. In her blog about the project, she wrote, "It feels as though I am almost pre-programmed to fall into the debilitating and numbing state of apathy when I read the news. And that's okay. Grief is an expression of gratitude," says the author Adrienne Marie Brown. It's okay to feel sad. It's important to feel grief. Grief is an emotional signal that we are aware of loss. It's also important to work towards healing, Danielle wrote, always. In the midst of changing times, in the midst of a looming future, we can also revel in the idea that such a change or a collapse can bring upon new ways of life. So I choose hope. Learning to grieve Danielle's death and celebrate her life in community allowed me to see the power and the potential of communal grieving for the earth and all of her inhabitants. Walter Brueggemann, in his book, Reality, Grief, Hope, 3 Urgent Prophetic Tasks, suggests that practices of public grief over a world that is changed are a prophetic act. He writes, "Grief turns loss to energy for newness." For 3 years now, people around the world have gathered together by a nearby waterway to celebrate Danielle's life and mark her death. Each year we have sung songs together, read poems, shared memories, and especially we have read the poem When Death Comes by Mary Oliver. In the poem, Oliver writes, "When death comes, I want to say all my life, I was a bride married to amazement. I was the bridegroom taking the world into my arms. Alongside grief for the world comes wonder, beauty, joy, and love. And when we turn our attention to these things, we can learn to be transformed by them. As I continue to apprentice myself to sorrow and to joy and wonder and love, I open myself up to experience and acknowledge the pain and suffering of others, both human and more than human. And I have become more able, like compost, to transform the death and decay into life-giving soil and hopeful action that can lead to the flourishing of all creation." Thanks.
Thank you, Zoe. And thank you all of our panelists for the profound words that you've shared with us today. Once again, I speak in gratitude, and as I look through my notes, I can see how much each one of you has put great thought into this. Marta, you spoke about the tension between hope and despair. Josiah, you had thoughts on deep adaptation and the unsettling feeling of uncertainty. Bob, your thoughts on sorrow and community are very relevant. And Zoe, having a very personal experience to share. Thanks to all of you for exploring the idea of grief, ecological grief. A personal question that I have from myself to you is, where do you find practical ways or practical hope in your everyday lives? What does hope look like for each one of you?
I mean, there's lots to be said. I guess for me, one thing is to move, to engage the body in the world, and the spirit tends to catch up. Now, whether that means playing with a drawing or bending some wire, or even walking the dog and taking in the life of trees and the street and so I mean that's just one small personal strategy, but it's a recognition that the body is often wiser than the head and the heart. So I let it begin often, begin the day in movement.
Thank you.
I, especially at this time of year, think about growing plants. I get very excited about spending some time outdoors and participating in that, bringing forth of life and nourishment, and then sharing that with people. Even if it is now just bringing a meal to someone and putting it on their doorstep, that sharing of food is a source of hope for me.
Thank you.
I think I find hope in communal action. I'm part of a few different groups, one of which is Manitoba Energy Justice Coalition, a group that's working for climate justice and supports Indigenous communities that are resisting fossil fuel development on their lands. And that's what I find the most hopeful, is being, in the streets with people who are grieving the same things I'm grieving, but it's not paralyzing for them. They're able to take action together, and there's lots of action that needs to be taken. And when you take it with a group of people, it lifts the spirits in a way that's really powerful.
I would say for me, I've found hope through my work with Arasha, and seeing similar to what Josiah said, seeing a community of people who care come together to do work and to persevere in a place over the long haul. And so we've seen over the 35 years of Arasha's history how that perseverance has led to some really cool positive changes, like wetlands being transformed and deserts being turned back into forests and things like that. And so it's things that are maybe not completely visible immediately, but over the long haul, we've seen these amazing changes. So that's what's giving me hope.
Thank you.
I guess to follow, just to follow up on that too. I think the explicitly the kind of acts of whether it's drawing or whatever, for me is involved with partnerships. So there are a number of groups I work with, and if you wish, are at the service of. So there's a group, Global Water Futures. Tomorrow we have a launch. This sculpture behind this wood piece, which is you can't really see it. It's one of three wood sculptures in stone. But it's work in collaboration with scientists. So here's an initiative of 12 groups of scientists working with artists from across the country who together are trying to articulate the work of scientific research and investigation into key areas. So I'm working with a group who are attending to northern rivers across Canada and the water flow and the effect of hydro and climate. And so the image behind it is river music wreck near Kiosk Dam. And there's another one, grieving forest near Missy Falls Dam. So, to me, that's, there's a reason and purpose. And there's in this case, they're setting up, there's a gallery that opens tomorrow through the Global Water Futures. I guess one other, and these are all gifts. I mean, in a sense, they're work, but one also, as Jose says, it is that one has a sense of giftedness, and Zoe's mentioned it too. I mean, that one receives in the process. But just finishing a work with Kathleen Moore some of you may know, Great Tide Rising and Pine Island Paradox and other things, but it's 25 of her essays and 25 drawings. So it just entangles me in things that, you know, you feel you're touching issues in a small way, you know, but engaging from different angles. So that's both a task and a gift. It's good to do them. Their work, but lucky to have ways of engaging. So more explicitly, those are the forms of body work that I would some that I'm engaged in. Yeah.
Thank you, Bob. I've seen some of your images and your woodwork, and it's quite incredible, for sure. We have a question regarding lament. What is lament? How do we practice it? Are there rituals, and is it healing? And can it be done as a communal activity? Is there someone who would like to touch on the practice of lament?
I can just speak briefly about something that we did as part of our Wild Church community for Easter. We held a Easter Friday or Good Friday vigil out at Omens Creek Park. And we had, well, less than 25 people. So we were gathered distance, but still together. And we participated in something called the stone ritual, where we gathered items from around us and spoke aloud our feelings and our emotions and our griefs. And together with standing out there with all creation, with the geese flying and honking and the water flowing by us, we mourned the losses that we were feeling. And we allowed those feelings to move into the items and put them into a bowl full of water, allowing the earth and the water to hold those emotions. And then we took that water and those items and we dumped them out back into the earth to be transformed into something nourishing. And I can speak about it, but when you experience it, it was really powerful for a lot of us because we were able to, there's not a lot of times in our life where we're allowed to speak about grief and speak those feelings. And so to share them with other people was really important, and to share them on Easter, on Good Friday with Jesus, who knows the most potent of sorrows as well. Yeah, was just a really powerful thing. So to answer the question, yeah, I think it can be communal. And yes, there are lots of rituals that we can participate in that can help us facilitate that and yeah, and transform it into something else.
Thank you, Zoe, for sharing. Alongside this question, we have, we are asked how a community can grieve in healthy ways during COVID, especially when we do not necessarily have the community right around us. This question was directed for Bob, but it is open to any of the panelists who would like to talk, who would like to touch on it. Or maybe we can frame it differently. How have you as panelists experienced grief and hope during the past year in regard to COVID?
Well, I guess for me, and is seeking out and finding a community is one thing. And different folks attuned to different worship communities. That's certainly to begin there, and is one option. The other is seeking them out. I'm a reader, and through imagination and the discipline of meditation and prayer is another way of engaging the larger world. So I would encourage that. Without community, it's very difficult. It is challenging. Music for some people to enter into song, enter into through dance and song are ways that, you know, I'm thinking of secondary. I mean, there are ways too that work in their own way, and I would encourage those too. If community isn't part of your life, and the discipline of meditation and worship, which you know, you can't just call it up at any given time. It kind of comes out of a history of practice. So others, I'm sure, have good advice on this.
I would jump off of where you had spoken earlier, Bob, and say I've been gifted by conversations while walking outside, and to find ways of community, whether that's 2 or just 3 or 4 people, and yeah, enjoy being outside and being able to have conversation and to not have conversation, and to walk together outside, and let that speak as well.
To find a place and in nature, some people, you know, I mean, that's crucial, to go and find a quiet place, even if it's just under a tree in a park. A friend who did counseling with women after the war in Liberia was told by the women, and some 90% of the women suffered greatly as a result of the war from both sides, and the abuse they suffered. And following the war, they went to the elders of their village, in this case, the village where my friend was working doing crisis counseling. They went to the elder and said, you know, we talk, our grief is so great, we need to talk about it. We're disabled by what has happened to us. And the elder says, well, right now we just don't have enough elders to hear your stories or to get the help. And the elder then went on to say, let us begin by each of you going into the forest and finding a tree and sit with that tree and begin by telling that tree where you feel to home what is going on in you. Begin there. And they did. And it was important. So when the crisis counseling then happened, those stories and ability to speak the heart was begun. But I mean, others sit by brooks, others sit by trees, others sit looking out a window at the light on the brick wall across the way and see the movement of the light in the morning and begin there in gratitude. So it's hard to say what specifically, but certainly to go back to the larger issue of engagement with the earth and to be present to the earth in its many manifestations can open us up in ways that we can't anticipate. So it's not so much knowing a thing to do as going and being still and knowing that I am not God, and maybe letting that begin and speak.
I would just echo what Bob said. 2 years ago, I participated in a silent retreat all about ecological grief, and there are some of those happening even online while we're in COVID. And there's groups such as the Good Grief Network that help people work through, like if you don't have a community near you, they have online forums that help people work through. They have a 10-step program, in fact, that helps people work through ecological grief, and they even have a special one for parents, helping parents talk to their kids about these kinds of topics. But I highly recommend, if you're able to do a silent retreat, that it's quite something to spend time in silence in nature, reflecting, and it's uncomfortable, but that uncomfort teaches us something that like, what is there to learn? Why are we uncomfortable with it? And then to seek the root causes of that, and to question ourselves, and yeah, it can help us move towards reconciliation and seeking out, I guess, more love for ourselves and for our feelings.
These are phenomenal thoughts. Thank you. So I want to go thank you all for coming today and engaging in this important conversation. I would like to give special thanks of gratitude to all of our panelists for the wisdom and experience they shared. Thank you. As well, thank you to all who have been a part of making this happen behind the scenes. Tim Kirkshank has been involved in monitoring the chat, so he's helped me greatly in setting this up. And Chris Huebner and Kenton Moby have been guiding me in an independent study. Thank you to everyone there. Also, thank you for supporting Arasha and the work of Creation Care. You can find us online at arasha.ca, on Facebook, on Instagram, and come visit one of our centers when it's safe to do so. I hope, as all of you go from here, that this conversation on ecological grief will challenge you to find new ways of acknowledging grief and to step forward in hope, knowing that new life can indeed come from death. I will leave you with a poem by Maya Angelou to close. It is titled When Great Trees Fall. When great trees fall, rocks on distant hills shudder. Lions hunker down in tall grasses, and even elephants lumber in safety. When great trees fall, in forests, small things recoil into silence, their senses eroded beyond fear. When great souls die, the air around us becomes light, rare, sterile. We breathe briefly. Our eyes, briefly, see with a hurtful clarity. Our memory, suddenly sharpened, examines, gnaws on kind words unsaid, promised walks never taken. Great souls die, and our reality bound to them takes leave of us. Our souls, dependent on their nurture, now shrink, wizened. Our minds, formed and informed by their radiance, fall away. We are not so much maddened as reduced to the unutterable ignorance of dark, cold caves. And when great souls die, after a period peace blooms, slowly and always, irregularly. Spaces fill with a kind of soothing electric vibration. Our senses restored, never to be the same, whisper to us. They existed, they existed. We can be and be better because they existed. Thank you all for coming. May you go in peace, knowing that we can be and be better because they existed.